University of Toronto psychology professor Jordan Peterson has a fight on his hands after objecting to proposed legislation that he says would violate his freedom of speech by forcing him to address transgendered people using the pronouns of their choosing. Joining us now to better understand the issue and debate what's at stake, in Vancouver, British Columbia, Theron Meyer, transgender pundit and YouTuber. In the nation's capital, Kyle Kirkup, professor of law at the University of Ottawa. And here in studio, the aforementioned Jordan Peterson, professor of psychology, University of Toronto, Nicholas Matt, lecturer, transgender studies at U of T, and Mary Rogan, whose article entitled Growing Up Trans is featured in the October issue of The Walrus magazine. Good to have you three here and our two friends in Points Beyond. We appreciate everybody being on the program for what is, I think, one of the hottest topics in the country today, Professor Peterson, and it's all because of you. And I think before we go any further with our conversation here, I want to give people a sense of how hot this has got, starting on the downtown campus of the University of Toronto. Sheldon, if you would, roll it.
Okay. Well, as you can see, the opponents of free speech are capable of making a lot of inarticulate noise. Free speech is the mechanism by which we keep our society functioning. Woo!
And by doing this, you're imposing, whoa, 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 wait, no, not cool, not cool.
I'm going to post this online that you would like people to be more accommodating of trans people and people of color at your events in future.
I would like there to be no violence.
I'm a person of color and I felt very accommodating.
There have been multiple recorded instances of trans people killing themselves because they are not being integrated into society.
If it wasn't for this law and I asked you to refer to me with they them pronouns, would you?
Why do you have the authority to determine whether or not an individual is worthy of you using their pronouns? Like, if I asked you, would you please use they them pronouns for me? What?
It would depend on what I thought of your motivation.
What hoops do you want us to jump through?
Those are my pronouns.
Okay, with indulgence of everybody else on the program, I'm going to start with Professor Peterson off the top here for a while because, as I suggested, you thought long and hard about this. You posted a few things up to YouTube asking us to lay the case out. What is it you find offensive about this legislation?
Well, fundamentally, there were two things that really bothered me, although there have been other things I've thought about since. One was that I was being asked, as everyone is, to use a certain set of words that I think are the constructions of people who have a political ideology that I don't believe in and that I also regard as dangerous.
What are those words?
Those are the made-up words that people now describe as gender neutral. And so, to me, they're an attempt to control language and in a direction that isn't happening organically. It's not happening naturally. People aren't picking up these words in the typical way that new words are picked up, but by force and by fiat. And I would say by force because there's legislative power behind them. So and I don't like these made-up words, Z and Zer and that sort of thing.
Okay, what about, they're not all made-up, quote-unquote made-up words. For example, they is one of them. Yeah, but to speak to an individual as they.
Right, but we can't dispense with the distinction between singular and plural. I mean, I know that the advocates of that particular approach say that they has been used forever as a singular, and that's actually not correct. It's used as a singular in very exceptional circumstances, like if your child wishes to bring a book to school, they're welcome to do so. But
that's just grammatically incorrect.
Well, it is also, there's some debate about that because it is, they is used like that sometimes. But it's never been used as a singular replacement for he or she. And so it's not a tenable solution. And that's the best of the solutions.
So we understand your views and where you're coming from. Let's do one more question here and then we'll get everybody else into the conversation. You know, of course, that since this story broke, you've been called a lot of things.
Yeah.
One of which is a transphobe.
Yeah.
Some people have accused you of using the free speech issue to mask what's really going on here, which is an attempt to deprive other people of what they believe are their legitimate rights. Well, and I want to give you the opportunity to speak to whether or not you are a transphobe.
Well, I can tell you that I've received more letters from transsexual people supporting me than opposing me. And I never said anything really about transsexual people, about their existence, although that was the first thing that I was accused of doing. I didn't say that transsexual people didn't exist. I said that gender identity, gender expression, and biological sex do not vary independently, which they don't. And so this issue is in some sense only peripherally about about transsexual issues. It's more centrally about gender issues. And then on top of that, and I think it's the biggest issue, is that it's a free speech issue.
Okay, let us continue to explore all of those issues that you have just raised. And why don't we do this? Let's take a moment. New York City, for example, recognizes 31 such gender expressions. In other words, besides man and woman, there are 29 other gender expressions. For example, pangender, queer gender, gender fluid, cross-dresser, bigendered, gender blender, and the list goes on. And Nicholas, this is where I want to bring you into the discussion because you teach this. You teach trans studies. So if you would, give us a brief primer on so many gender identities that, in your view, require non-traditional pronouns.
Basically, it's not correct that there is such a thing as biological sex. And I'm a historian of medicine. I can unpack that for you at great length if you want, but in the interest of time, I won't. So that's a very popular misconception. So essentially, when in my transgender studies classes, what we're doing is looking at actual research and identifying ways that current social issues related to trans people or things that are associated with trans, such as free speech arguments and claims, how that connects to the way that people are thinking, the way that research has been framed, the histories.
Give us some of the other pronouns that one would hear, typically.
I don't focus on pronouns because pronouns are actually part of a cisnormative culture. So what we do is learn about...
I'm going to stop you right there.
Yes, I was just about to explain.
Good.
So we don't start from a cisnormative perspective because that can't actually go very far.
What does cisnormative mean?
So I'm going to start us there. Cisnormative is basically the very popular idea and assumption that most people probably have, and definitely that our structures convey, that there is such a thing as male and female, that they connect to being a girl or a boy or a man or a woman, and then sometimes that will also recognize intersex or trans people or transsexual people, as you mentioned, because that's sometimes also referred to as a gender binary. So anything that fits within a gender binary can work within cisnormativity.
Okay.
But cisnormativity is basically that everyone assumes that there is male and female, and so very little is actually looked at to understand what's actually the case. And scientists have been doing this for at least over 50 years.
Your view would be it's much more complicated than that.
Right. It's not my view. I just know that for over 50 years, scientists have shown that that's not true, and yet our social systems haven't been able to find a way to address the level of complexity that people actually experience.
Can I step in, Steve?
Stand by for a second, because I want to let everybody else get in first,
And I
then we'll get you in.
you either. So.
And that means, and people are always looking for new tools to operate in the world. And if you invent a good tool, like a new word, then people will pick it up just as fast as they possibly can. You really see that in English. But the words that are being required now are not good tools, and that's why people aren't using them. And so instead what we have is the use of force, despite the fact that that's being denied. Although we've already established that, at least in the opinion of one of the people on this panel, I'm already guilty of a hate crime, which is what I said I was guilty of when I made that video. Steve, the issue with the law is quite straightforward. The government is requiring us to use certain language. That's not the same as not using certain language. And it's a line, and this is the fundamental issue. This is maybe the fundamental issue. That's a line we should not cross. We should not allow the government to decide which words we're allowed to use. It's a mistake. And it's a mistake that strikes right at the heart of free speech. And the thing about free speech is that it's not the right to criticize your leaders, which is what people usually characterize it as. Is freedom of speech is freedom to engage in the processes that we use to formulate the problems in our society, to generate solutions to them and reach a consensus. It's actually a mechanism. It's not just another value. And you should put constraints on free speech with the most extreme caution, because you interfere with people's ability to think and communicate.
Let me get Theron to weigh in. Theron, you've been hearing the debate here in the studio. Why don't you weigh in and pick it up?
Well, I guess I'm in the same boat as Dr. Peterson when it comes to being guilty of a hate crime. Or a hate speech infringement, because I mean, I draw the line somewhere. For example, I refuse to use pronouns like sie, them, zer. I don't have a problem using they, them, their pronouns, and that also happens just to be because of the circles in which I move. I happen to know people who use gender-neutral pronouns, so I've gotten used to it. But the vast majority of people are not going to come into contact with the incredibly small fraction of the population of gender non-binary people. And that's why this is never really going to pick up, in my opinion. You know, when it comes to Mrs. and Ms., at least half of the population is female. So there was some interaction with the term Mrs. versus Ms. And there were some interactions so people could pick it up. There just aren't enough gender non-binary. I use that in quotation marks because I hate that term, because it's a political term, not a gender identity or a term of identification. It's just a political term. But regardless, I don't think it's going to pick up. There's just not enough of these people to interact with.
Do you agree that C16 ought to be able to prevent people from expressing negative opinions about transgender people?
So first I want to clarify that Bill C-16 only applies to federally regulated entities. So for example, the University of Toronto is under provincial jurisdiction, so is therefore subject to the Ontario Human Rights Code. So I think that's an important point to note. I also want to note there's been a lot of talk about the hate crimes. That seems to be like kind of an American import into our discussion. The only two changes that this Bill C-16 make are to make minor amendments to Section 318 and 718 of the Criminal Code.
Right. I think we've set the table now. You want to get in on this now, I can tell. You've heard what the professor has to say. What's your response?
Well, I don't understand what the claim that there's no such thing as biological sex means, and I certainly think it's, let's call it an error, to suggest that there's some sort of scientific consensus about that. I mean, there's biological differences between males and females in animals and human beings at every level of analysis.
Okay, I'm jumping in here, because what about the notion he put forward at the end there, that if you do not refer to people with the pronoun that they prefer to be referred to, that is a form, according to the Human Rights Commission, of discrimination?
It's not just a form of discrimination, it's a form of hate speech. That's why I made the video. I said that we were in danger of placing the refusal to use certain kinds of language into the same category as Holocaust denial, and suggested that maybe that wasn't such a good idea, especially since there's plenty of debate to be had about gender issues in our society, which I also think are also in danger of becoming illegal, and quite rapidly. So it isn't clear to me how long we'll be able to have the talk that we're having right now.
Of advocating genocide. And we have a series of groups that are already identified in the code, and all this does is add gender identity and gender expression to the categories that are already identified. And so I think we really have to add some reasonableness to this discussion, actually clearly articulate what the provision does.
Well, let me be a little clear about what some of the problems, what you might be asking for if you want to do this. For example, and Sheldon, bottom of page 3 here, let's put this graphic up. Pronoun misuse may become actionable through the human rights tribunals and the courts, and the remedies, monetary damages, non-financial remedies, for example, ceasing the discriminatory practice or reinstatement to the job, and public interest remedies, for example, changing hiring practices or developing non-discriminatory policies and procedures. Jail time is not one of them. Jordan, you're not going to go to jail if you keep this up. Do you find that reassuring?
What if I don't pay the fine?
Then what?
Then what? And let's talk about the legalities for a minute. As you know, the University of Toronto sent me 2 warning letters, right? And the second one basically asked me to stop talking about this.
Who sent the letters?
The first, it's the administration, fundamentally, the higher-up people in the administration. The last one was the Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Science. But, you know, it's coming from the top end of the university.
And the letter said, essentially, you must call people by the pronouns they want?
The letters basically said that, and this is paraphrasing, obviously, that as I'm required to abide by the university policies and the Ontario Human Rights Code, and there's a strong implication in the letter by having this discussion that I wasn't doing so, and so they're asking me to stop. And I can tell you also why they're asking me to stop apart from that. The codes as written make the university just as liable for my speech as I am. So not only is there a reasonable possibility that what I'm doing is uttering hate speech now under our law, but the university is legally responsible for that. And so I think they consulted with their lawyers and decided that maybe the claim that I was making in my video was correct. So I don't regard that as trivial, and I think that the lawyer who's discussing this is downplaying the significance of it tremendously.
Could I speak to the campus climate about this? Because I don't agree with why Dr. Peterson has been asked to stop abusing students on campus.
To stop doing what?
Abusing students.
I see.
And other members of our learning community who do deserve respect and do deserve to be able to work and learn and contribute to society in a place where if they are physically assaulted, if they are...
The assault so far came from the social justice warriors who were at this free speech rally, and almost 2 million people have watched this.
Smile on me, bitch. What you want?
Yeah, so they did grab me and pull me in and try to punch me. They're the person right over there with the black lipstick.
That's assault right there.
Officer, I didn't see anything. I didn't see anything that happened.
There's no reason to be
I didn't see anything.
First of all, the other people there over there shouting and stuff.
Yeah, nothing happened. I didn't see anything. Nothing happened. I didn't see
anything. Almost 2 million people have watched those so far.
This is not accurate.
Well, you can look at the videos yourself.
Because people have been making complaints about your behavior.
Yes, I understand that.
Yes.
Yep.
And so we're seeing a greater opportunity for social justice happening that many people won't understand.
Nick, can I be clear on something? You've accused him of abusing students by not using the pronouns they want to be addressed by.
That's how I see it, absolutely.
That is tantamount to abuse in your view.
Absolutely. Many global documents, many organizations.
How about violence? Is it tantamount to violence?
Yes,
How about hate speech? Is it tantamount to hate speech?
Yes, of course. It's hate speech to tell someone that you won't refer to them as in a way that they that recognizes their humanity and dignity.
And are you prepared to suffer the consequences that society may deem you need to suffer because of your views?
Yes, I'm prepared to do that.
What does that entail?
Are you open to learning?
Well, hang on.
That's not the question.
Hang on, that wasn't the question.
That's
true.
Right.
Well, so what am I willing to do? Well, I think that the Ontario Human Rights Tribunal is probably obligated by their own tangled web to bring me in front of it. If they find me, I won't pay it. If they put me in jail, I'll go on a hunger strike. I'm not doing this. And that's that. I'm not using the words that other people require me to use, especially if they're made up by radical left-wing ideologues. Now, if our society comes to some sort of consensus over the next while about how we'll solve the pronoun problem, let's call it, and that becomes part of popular parlance, and it seems to solve the problem properly without sacrificing the distinction between singular and plural, and without requiring me to memorize an impossible list of an indefinite number of pronouns, then I would be willing to reconsider my position. But I'm also partly opposed to this because it's been made mandatory and has the whole weight of the law behind it. It's like, this is a very bad idea. I believe this is a very bad idea. And I believe that the reason this has caused so much noise, tremendous amount of noise, tremendous amount of attention on YouTube, is because there are things that are at stake in this discussion, despite its surface nature, that strike at the very heart of our civilization.
Theron Meyer, the trans pundit and YouTuber in Vancouver, Kyle Kirkup, the professor of law at University of Ottawa. We thank both of you for being outside our studio, but part of our broadcast tonight. Jordan Peterson at the U of T, Nick Matt from the U of T, Mary Rogan. You can read more about this in her piece, Growing Up Trans, in the October issue of Walrus Magazine, on better bookstore and corner store stands everywhere. Thanks so much, everybody.